We decided it was time to escape the routine. My wife, our 2 children and I needed some time away from the city, away from the hustle and bustle that seemed to consume us day after day. The holiday was the perfect excuse to isolate ourselves in a quiet place where we could enjoy some quality time together. That was what we desired most. Our family consists of me, my wife Julia, our eldest son Lucas, who just turned 16 and is in that phase of discovering the world on his own, and little Clara, full of energy and curiosity at 8 years old. It was the first time we would take a trip like this, just the 4 of us, and I was excited about the idea of reconnecting. The beach house we rented seemed perfect in the photos. The description mentioned a peaceful place with an incredible view of the sea, and the fact that it was a bit isolated from the other houses attracted us. We wanted peace, and that place seemed ideal. When we arrived, the house was exactly as we imagined, or almost. It was charming, with its classic architecture, a garden that had seen better days, but was still enchanting. However, there was something about the house that made me uneasy. Perhaps it was the fact that despite being well maintained on the outside, it showed clear signs of neglect in certain details. Windows with partially broken shutters, paint peeling in some places, and an unusual silence that, instead of bringing peace, seemed to carry a weight we couldn't ignore. Julia tried to reassure me, saying it was just the age of the house that gave that impression, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. In any case, we were there to relax and enjoy each other's company. The sea was in front of us, the house was ours for the next weekend, and I was determined to make the most of every moment with my family, even with that uncomfortable feeling lingering in the air. The trip to the beach house was smooth, almost peaceful. The kids slept most of the way, and Julia and I exchanged few words, both immersed in our own thoughts. The road leading to the coast was lined with old trees, whose tops formed a natural tunnel over the road. The sun filtered through the leaves, creating a play of light and shadow that seemed hypnotic. But as beautiful as the scenery was, there was a vague feeling of discomfort that I couldn't shake. When we finally spotted the house, a light sea breeze greeted us, bringing with it the salty smell we loved so much. The house was at the end of a small dirt road, isolated from the others. It was as if it was waiting for us, lonely, amid the vegetation that surrounded it. I parked the car in front of the entrance, and for a moment, we all stayed silent, just observing the place that would be our refuge for the next few days. The first impression was good. The house had a cozy air, as if inviting us to enter and leave the world outside. The old-fashioned style, with wooden walls and large windows, gave a nostalgic feeling, reminiscent of those old country houses in movies. But at the same time, there was something that didn't quite fit, something that seemed out of place. As we unloaded the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. There was no one around, just the silence of the countryside and the distant sound of waves crashing on the beach. But that feeling of being watched was persistent. It seemed irrational, but it was real. Even the children, usually so noisy and restless, seemed quieter than usual. Julia, always practical, started organizing things inside the house while Lucas and Clara ran to explore the surroundings. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the impression that something was wrong. I looked around at the trees, the windows, but saw nothing unusual. Even so, that discomfort persisted, like a shadow that refused to disappear. Inside the house, everything seemed in order, but there was still that strange feeling. Each room was well lit and spacious, but something seemed to be missing. Perhaps it was just the exhaustion from the trip, or maybe it was the house, with its air of abandonment, disguised under a cozy facade. Either way, I decided to ignore these thoughts. We were there to relax, and I was determined to do just that, even with that strange feeling that we were not alone. At first, the house seemed to be exactly what we needed, a quiet refuge where we could disconnect from the world. But as we settled in, I started to notice small things that bothered me. Details that at first glance could be ignored, but that together created an unsettling feeling. On the first morning, when I went down to the kitchen, I noticed that one of the windows was slightly open. I clearly remembered locking all the windows the night before, concerned about security since we were in an isolated place. I found it strange, but attributed it to the wind that might have loosened the latch. I closed the window and went back to focusing on breakfast. Later, while we were tidying up the living room, Julia commented that the coffee table seemed to have been moved. Something so small that would normally go unnoticed, but the table was a little out of place, as if someone had pushed it, even if just a little. We both laughed at the idea of the table moving on its own and adjusted it back, but the feeling that something was not right persisted. Then Clara, always curious, came running to me with wide eyes. She said she had seen someone in the garden, near the trees. "It was a person, Daddy. They were looking at me," she said, pointing to the spot. I looked out the window, but saw nothing but the trees swaying gently in the wind. I tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just a shadow or some animal. Children have fertile imaginations, I thought, but Clara insisted she had seen someone, and I couldn't convince her otherwise. These small details, as insignificant as they seemed, started to accumulate in my mind. The window that opened on its own, the furniture that seemed to move, Clara seeing figures that weren't there. All of this began to form a disturbing picture, even though I tried to rationalize each event. Julia seemed less concerned, believing it was just the effect of the new house and the different environment. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something more. Something that was there, lurking in the corners, invisible but present. No matter how much we tried to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination, the feeling of discomfort grew, as if the house was trying to tell us something we still couldn't understand. It was on the second day that we discovered the locked room. We were exploring the house more calmly, trying to familiarize ourselves with every corner. Julia, Lucas, Clara, and I went up to the upper floor where the bedrooms were located. It was a part of the house we hadn't fully explored yet. As we walked down the hallway, we noticed a door at the end that seemed different from the others. It was older, with signs of wear that the other doors didn't have. When I tried to turn the handle, it didn't budge. It was locked. "Strange," I commented, trying not to show my frustration. All the other doors in the house were open, and it made no sense for a single door to be locked, especially in a rented house. My first reaction was to try to force the handle again, but it didn't move. There was something about that door that increased my curiosity, almost as if it was challenging me to open it. Lucas, always the most curious, suggested that I force the door, but Julia gave me a look that made me reconsider. We weren't there to cause damage or tamper with something that wasn't ours. I decided to leave the door alone, at least for the time being. "It must be a storage room or a room they didn't want us to use," I said, trying to sound unconcerned. But the truth was that my curiosity only grew. What could be behind that door? And why was it locked when the rest of the house was free for us to use? Julia seemed less interested, and the children, after a few minutes of speculation, went back to exploring other rooms. But I couldn't get the door out of my mind. There was something there, something that seemed to be calling me, asking to be discovered. However, I decided not to force it. Perhaps it was better that way, I thought. But as the day passed, that locked door became a constant presence in my mind. It was as if the house had secrets it didn't want to reveal, and I was starting to realize there was more there than we imagined. That first night was more difficult than I expected. After a long day exploring the house and trying to ignore the small strangeness that had emerged, I was exhausted. Julia and the kids were already asleep, and I finally turned off the lights, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But it didn't take long for the silence of the night to be interrupted. At first, there were only subtle noises, almost imperceptible. I thought they were the normal sounds of an old house settling into the night's cold. But as time passed, the sounds became clearer, more defined. It seemed like someone was walking on the porch. Light footsteps, but deliberate, as if they were testing the ground. I remained still in bed, trying to listen more closely. Perhaps it was an animal, I thought. Something small, like a cat, searching for shelter. But then I heard a distinct sound, a slight click, as if someone was trying to turn the front door handle, testing it to see if it was locked. My heart raced. I got up from the bed slowly, trying not to make any noise. Julia stirred but continued sleeping, unaware of what was happening. I grabbed my phone, using the light from the screen to illuminate the way as I headed toward the front door. The house was engulfed in almost total darkness. The only sound besides my footsteps was the slight creaking of the floorboards under my feet. When I reached the living room, the sense of unease increased. The door was in front of me, and the sounds had ceased, but the air seemed heavy, as if something was waiting on the other side. I approached the door cautiously, trying to listen for any sign of movement. But all I found was silence. A silence so deep, it was deafening. With a trembling hand, I touched the handle. It was cold but firm. I turned it slowly and opened the door carefully, just a crack, enough to peek outside. The darkness outside was almost impenetrable, the gentle wind barely swaying the trees. There was no sign of anyone, nothing to justify the sounds I had heard. I closed the door carefully, locking it again and checking to make sure it was secure. I returned to the bedroom, trying to convince myself that I had imagined everything, that perhaps the fatigue and tension of the day had played a trick on me. But as I lay down again, that feeling that something was wrong persisted. I couldn't shake the idea that there was someone out there, watching, waiting. Even after I finally fell asleep, the sounds of footsteps and the click of the handle echoed in my mind, like a silent warning that the night still held secrets I was not ready to uncover. The next morning, while Julia and Clara were preparing breakfast, Lucas decided to explore the house on his own. He had always been curious, and the idea of discovering hidden secrets in an old place like that seemed to attract him more than the discomfort the house was causing us. I watched him go up the stairs with that gleam in his eyes that he had when he was about to embark on one of his small adventures. I let him go, thinking it would be good for him to distract himself a bit. After all, it was a big house, full of nooks and crannies to explore. What could be so disturbing about rummaging through some old rooms? After a while, I noticed that Lucas hadn't returned. I went upstairs to see what he was up to. I found him in the attic, a place we hadn't explored until then. The space was small and dimly lit, with dusty windows that let in just a sliver of light. It was filled with boxes and furniture covered by sheets, as if someone had left everything there that they no longer wanted to see. Lucas was kneeling on the floor, holding something in his hands. As I approached, I saw that it was a diary, old and battered, with a faded cover and yellowed pages. He looked at me with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Dad, look what I found," he said, holding the diary out for me to see. I took the diary from his hands, and as I flipped through the pages, I realized it was the record of a family that had lived there before us. The first pages were filled with simple notes, details of daily life, like who cooked dinner, who fixed the front gate. But as I continued, the entries began to grow darker. The tone of the diary shifted to something more unsettling. There were descriptions of noises at night, footsteps on the stairs, doors that locked by themselves. The family writing these words was clearly being disturbed by something in the house, something they couldn't see but felt every moment. Lucas was beside me, reading the words with me, and I could see that he was starting to understand that this house might not be the refuge we had imagined. The last pages of the diary spoke of a growing sense of fear, that something or someone was always around, watching. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped. The diary ended without explanation, leaving a void that seemed to echo in the silence of the attic. I closed the diary and looked at Lucas. He was quiet, absorbing what we had just read. "What happened to them, Dad?" he asked. his voice low and hesitant. I had no answer to give him. All I knew was that this diary, with its words faded by time, told us a story that should never have been forgotten. Something in that house, in that place, had haunted another family before us. And now, it seemed we were beginning to understand why. "Let's go downstairs, son," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's just an old book. There's nothing to worry about." But as we descended the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that what we had found was only the beginning of something much darker. I couldn't get the diary out of my mind after Lucas found it. There was something about it, something disturbing that seemed to be waiting to be uncovered. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the living room with the diary in my hands, determined to read every word, hoping to understand what had really happened in that house. As I flipped through the pages, the tone of the diary became increasingly darker. The family that lived there before us seemed to have faced a series of inexplicable events. At first, they were small things, similar to what we were experiencing. Noises during the night, objects that moved, the constant feeling of being watched. But then, things began to escalate. The entries mentioned the presence of someone or something that seemed to always be nearby, but was never seen. The woman who wrote the diary, clearly trying to maintain her sanity amid the chaos, described the feeling of being watched all the time, of hearing whispers in the darkness, of seeing shadows moving where there should be nothing. But what really gave me chills were the entries about the deaths. They weren't described in detail, but enough to make me understand that this family had suffered inexplicable tragedies. First, it was the eldest son, found dead in his room, with no apparent explanation. The police found no signs of violence, and the case was closed as a natural death. But the diary's words suggested that the mother believed something else was involved. Then, it was the father's turn, who died under equally mysterious circumstances, falling from a staircase that, according to the family, was in perfect condition. Again, the authorities dismissed any possibility of foul play, but the mother was convinced that the house, or whatever was in it, was the true culprit. The last pages of the diary were the most disturbing. The mother wrote about the feeling that a malevolent presence had taken over the house, something that fed on the family's fear and pain. She mentioned visions of a dark figure that appeared in the corners of her vision, always out of focus, but unmistakably threatening. And then, the diary simply ended. No farewell, no conclusion. Just a blank page, as if the woman had been abruptly interrupted, as if something had finally reached what it was seeking. I closed the diary, the sound of the old wood creaking under the weight of my heavy breathing. I was sweating, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to think. All I knew was that this house, with its worn charm and welcoming appearance, hid secrets that should have remained buried. I got up from the chair and put the diary back in the attic, where Lucas had found it. As I closed the attic door, I couldn't shake the feeling that by reading those words, I had awakened something. Something that, until then, had been waiting patiently. And now, it seemed that this malevolent presence was beginning to stir again, fueled by the memories of a dark past that should never have been recalled. As I returned to my bedroom, I lay down next to Julia, trying not to think about what I had read. But the words of the diary echoed in my mind, and the darkness around me seemed thicker, more oppressive. I couldn't help but wonder, were we doomed to repeat the fate of that family? That night, the weight of the diary I had read wouldn't leave me in peace. I tried to distract myself, watch something on TV, but the image of the woman's words, the despair in her descriptions, continued to haunt me. Julia noticed that I was quieter than usual, but I didn't ask if she felt anything strange in the house. Perhaps I didn't want to scare her, or maybe I was trying to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence. But the second night in the house brought with it a sense of oppression that I could no longer ignore. Everything seemed normal until Clara, our daughter, began to act strangely. She had gone to bed early, exhausted after a day of playing on the beach, but around midnight I heard her crying from her room. I went to her room, expecting to find a child scared by a common nightmare. But when I entered the room, something made me freeze inside. Clara was sitting on the bed, her eyes wide open, staring fixedly at a dark corner of the room. When I approached, she slowly turned to me, still crying, and said something that left me speechless. "Daddy, there are shadows moving there, and they're laughing at me." I looked at the corner she was pointing to, but all I saw was darkness. I tried to calm my daughter, saying it was just her imagination, that maybe the shadows were from the trees outside. But she insisted, her voice trembling and terrified. "They were here, Daddy. They were laughing, but the sound was strange, like it was broken." My hands were sweaty and my heart was pounding so hard I could almost hear it. I held Clara in my arms, trying to soothe her while my own fear grew. Those distorted laughs she mentioned weren't the product of a child's imagination. I knew that. Something was surrounding us, something I couldn't see, but that was becoming increasingly present. After putting Clara back to sleep, I returned to my room, but sleep didn't come. Lying in bed, it felt like the eyes of the house were on me. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. I was being watched. Of that I had no doubt. It was an unsettling feeling, as if a pair of invisible eyes followed me wherever I went. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched. It was something deeper, as if the house was alive, breathing around me. The air was thicker, filled with a nearly palpable tension, and that sense of discomfort that was once just a shadow now became a real, overwhelming presence. I tried to rationalize, convince myself that I was exaggerating, that it was all just the effect of reading the diary and the strange environment. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Something was happening in that house, something beyond my understanding, and it was intensifying. As I turned in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was as if the entire house was conspiring, surrounding us with an invisible and malevolent presence. And in the silence of the night, with Clara sleeping next to Julia, I wondered if, at some point, it would stop, or if it was just beginning. I woke up that morning with a sense that something was definitely wrong. The previous night had been unsettling, to say the least. Clara barely slept after what she saw, and I couldn't rest for a second. The feeling of being watched persisted, even in the daylight. But things got even stranger when we started noticing that some of our personal belongings were disappearing. It all started with small things, almost insignificant. Julia's hairbrush, which she always left in the bathroom, was simply not there anymore. We searched everywhere, rummaged through drawers, cabinets, but we couldn't find it. In the end, we decided that maybe we had left it somewhere else without realizing it. Next, it was Lucas' watch. He had left it on the nightstand, but in the morning the watch was gone. Lucas was frustrated, accusing Clara of taking it as part of some prank, but Clara swore she hadn't touched it. Again, we searched every corner, but the watch was nowhere to be found. It all happened so quickly that I barely understood what was going on. After everything we had been through, the tension in the house was reaching a breaking point. I was trying to keep things normal for Clara and Lucas, but the atmosphere was heavy, and we all felt it. That afternoon, we were all in the living room, trying to enjoy a moment of tranquility, when I noticed that Clara was not around. I thought she was playing in her room, or maybe in the kitchen, but after calling her several times with no response, a sense of dread began to grow inside me. "Clara?" I called, trying to stay calm, but my voice already betrayed the anxiety I felt. Julia also got up, looking around, starting to get worried. We went from room to room, searching for Clara. Lucas joined us, and we started to scour the house, but she was nowhere to be found. My heart began to pound uncontrollably. The house wasn't that big. She had to be somewhere. It was then that Lucas suggested the attic. The thought chilled me to the bone. The attic, where we had found that diary, where nothing good seemed to exist. We ran upstairs, and when I opened the attic door, there was Clara. She was standing in the middle of the room, in a spot where the sunlight streamed in through a small, dirty window. She seemed petrified, staring fixedly at something I couldn't see. Her small shoulders were rigid, and her skin, usually rosy, was as pale as porcelain. "Clara!" I shouted, running to her. Julia arrived right behind me, but Clara didn't move. It was as if she was in a trance. I knelt beside her, touching her shoulder. When she finally turned to me, her eyes were glazed over, as if she was seeing something far beyond what was around us. And then she began to speak. But what came out of Clara's mouth was not something I could understand. It wasn't Portuguese, nor any language I had ever heard. The words were guttural, distorted, almost as if her voice was being dragged through a veil of darkness. Julia was paralyzed, staring at our daughter with pure terror. I tried to talk to Clara, shaking her gently, calling her name, but she continued to murmur in that incomprehensible language, her eyes still fixed on some distant point. It was as if the attic was infused with some strange energy, something I couldn't see, but that I felt all around us. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Clara blinked, and her words stopped abruptly. She looked at me, as if she had just woken up from a bad dream and collapsed into my arms, trembling. "Daddy, what happened?" she whispered, her voice weak and confused. I had no answers. All I knew was that something was wrong, deeply wrong. Clara didn't remember anything she had said or what had happened. I took her back to her room, where Julia tried to comfort her, but the feeling that we had crossed some kind of invisible boundary wouldn't leave me. I was terrified. The house was consuming us, dragging us into something much bigger and darker than any of us could imagine. And my daughter, my little Clara, had been touched by it. Whatever was in that attic, in that house, was getting closer to us, and I was beginning to fear that if we didn't find a way to leave soon, there would be no turning back. These small disappearances began to bother me in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the fact that the objects were disappearing, it was where they were being found. Julia found her hairbrush later that day at the bottom of a drawer in the kitchen, a place where she would never put it. And Lucas' watch? We found it days later, under Clara's bed, even though we had searched there before. But what really shook me was what happened to one of my belongings. My wedding ring, which I always took off before bed and left on the nightstand, disappeared one night. I became desperate, searching everywhere. It was a small object, but of immense sentimental value. I turned the room upside down, checked pockets, opened every drawer. Nothing. Then, a horrible idea crossed my mind. The locked room. I don't know why, but something led me to believe that my ring might be in there. I went to the door, more out of impulse than logic. I tried to open it again, even though I knew it was locked. To my surprise, the handle turned slightly, as if it had been recently unlocked, but it still wouldn't open completely. It was then that I felt a chill run down my spine. I remembered the diary and the things the former resident had described. With a bit more force, I managed to push the door open just enough to peek through a small crack. There, on the dusty floor of the room, was my ring, faintly glimmering in the light that filtered through the dirty window. I bent down, stretched my hand through the crack in the door, and managed to grab the ring. The cold metal against my skin felt almost strange, as if I was touching something that shouldn't be there. I quickly closed the door, my heart pounding in my chest. How did my ring end up in there? And why did the door now seem almost open when it was previously completely locked? Something was playing with us, moving our objects like pieces on a chessboard, and I knew it wasn't mere chance. The house seemed to be alive, playing with us, testing our limits. The ring, the watch, the hairbrush. They were just warnings, signs that we were not in control. I returned to the bedroom, trying to calm myself, but that cold feeling on my spine wouldn't leave me in peace. I was beginning to understand that this house, with all its secrets and shadows, had its own rules. And we were being forced to play a game we never asked to join. After what happened with Clara in the attic, I knew we couldn't stay in that house another minute. Something was surrounding us, dragging us into an abyss of terror that I couldn't understand. I didn't want to scare my family even more, but there was no way to ignore what was happening. That house, with all its shadows and secrets, was trapping us in a nightmare that seemed increasingly real. That morning, while Clara was still asleep, Julia and I sat in the kitchen. The words were stuck in my throat, but I knew I had to say what I was thinking. "Julia, we need to leave. Now." She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the same fear I felt. We knew that staying there was no longer an option. Lucas, who was trying to keep calm, also agreed. We all just wanted to get out of there, leave that house behind, and never look back. We quickly started packing our things. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting to see what we would do. Clara was still shaken, but we managed to make her understand that we were going home. Everything seemed under control until we walked out the front door and headed to the car. When I tried to start the car, the engine sputtered a few times before dying completely. I tried again, but the same result. Nothing. My heart began to pound in my chest. I checked the dashboard, opened the hood, but there was nothing obviously wrong. Yet no matter how much I tried, the car simply wouldn't start. Julia looked at me, her face growing paler. "What's happening, Vagner? Why won't the car start?" I had no answer, but I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Something was preventing us from leaving. It was as if the house wasn't ready to let us go. I decided that if the car wouldn't work, then we would try on foot. The town wasn't too far, and the road was basically a straight line to it. We took our things, determined to walk. But when we started down the road, we were met with something that chilled my blood. There were fallen tree trunks blocking the way, large and heavy, too much for one person to move alone. But the strangest thing was that these trunks didn't seem to have fallen naturally. They were perfectly arranged, as if someone, or something, had placed them there deliberately to prevent us from passing. I stopped, trying to understand what was happening. Julia and Lucas looked at me, waiting for me to know what to do, but my mind was blank. How could we be trapped like this? It was as if the house, or whatever was in it, had anticipated our moves and was keeping us captive. We returned to the car, hoping that by some miracle it would start. But nothing changed. Desperation began to set in. We were isolated, trapped in a place that was becoming increasingly hostile. I didn't know what to do, but I knew we couldn't stay there. We needed to find a way out before it was too late. With a heavy heart, we returned to the house. I knew it wasn't safe, but I also knew we had no other choice. We needed a plan, something to help us escape. As I closed the door behind us, I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. The house seemed to be laughing at us, satisfied with keeping us under its control. But I refused to give up. I had to protect my family, and I would do anything to ensure we got out of there alive, even if it meant facing whatever was keeping us there. After everything that had happened, I knew it was time to confront whatever was behind that locked door. The house was playing with us, manipulating our fears, and that room seemed to be the epicenter of it all. There was no longer any room for hesitation or doubt. We needed answers, and I was determined to find them. I climbed the stairs with a knot in my stomach, the silence of the house heavy around me. Julia and the children were in the living room, waiting for me, though I knew they were just as scared as I was. When I reached the locked room's door, I felt a wave of dread, but also a fierce determination. I had to know what was in there. I grabbed the handle, and with all the strength I could muster, I forced the door. It resisted for a moment, as if it was protected by some invisible force, but then it gave way with a loud crack that echoed through the house. The door opened slowly, creaking on its rusty hinges, revealing what was hidden inside. What I saw inside took my breath away. The room, which I expected to be covered in dust and neglect, was surprisingly tidy. There were no signs of mold or decay, like in the rest of the house. On the contrary, it seemed as if someone had been there recently, caring for the space with almost obsessive attention. The bed was made, the sheets clean, though a bit old. There was a faint smell of mold, mixed with something more recent, as if a candle had been lit not long ago. In the center of the room, on an old table, were objects that seemed out of place. A plate with remnants of food that hadn't completely decomposed, a half-full glass of water with fresh condensation droplets, and a notebook with a worn cover. I picked up the notebook and began to flip through it. The pages were filled with hurried handwriting, but the words made no sense, as if they had been written by someone in a state of extreme agitation. But the most disturbing part was the details. There were notes about our family, about our arrival, detailed descriptions of what each of us did at every moment of the day. It was as if someone had been watching us since we set foot in that house. The feeling of being watched, which had previously seemed like paranoia, was now a terrifying reality. I looked around, trying to find any other clue about who might have been living there, but there was nothing else. No name, no clear clue about who the author of these notes was, or why they were so obsessed with us. The only thing that became clear was that someone, or something, had been studying us, perhaps even manipulating us from the start. I returned to the table and saw something that made me shiver. In the corner of the room, an old mirror was turned toward the wall, as if someone wanted to hide their reflection. Approaching it, I felt a strange reluctance to touch the mirror, but I ended up turning it back around. The reflection that stared back at me was mine, but with something different, a subtle distortion that I couldn't identify, but that left me with goosebumps. I closed the notebook, my heart pounding. Everything in there told me we were in danger, but the biggest mystery still loomed. Who was doing this to us, and why? I returned to the door, feeling the weight of the room on my back. Before leaving, I looked back one last time, trying to memorize every detail. I knew we couldn't stay there any longer. That revelation, as incomplete as it was, gave me the certainty that the house was not just a place. It was a trap that someone had created, and we were right in the middle of it. I closed the door to the locked room, this time definitively. But I knew that what I had discovered inside could never really be left behind. The true enemy, the one who had been stalking us from the beginning, was still out there. And now, more than ever, I needed to find a way to protect my family before it was too late. After the discovery in the locked room, the weight of the truth began to bear down on us. I tried to hide the worst from Julia and the kids, but I knew I wasn't doing a good job of disguising the fear. Something was surrounding us, and it seemed that the more we tried to escape, the deeper we were pulled into the abyss that this house represented. That night, the air inside the house seemed thicker, as if every breath required a conscious effort. The darkness outside was impenetrable, and the silence was so thick it seemed to swallow all sound. We were all together in the living room trying to comfort each other with our presence, but the tension was palpable. Suddenly, without any warning, the house began to shake. At first, I thought it was an earthquake, but the intensity was strange, almost unnatural. The walls vibrated, and the furniture began to creak and move. Lucas grabbed my hand, and I saw pure fear in his eyes. Clara huddled next to Julia, whimpering softly. Before I could react, the doors and windows began to bang violently, as if an invisible force was trying to rip them from their hinges. The sound was deafening, and each bang seemed to reverberate in my chest, amplifying the panic that was about to consume me. I stood up, trying to calm everyone, but I could barely hear my own voice over the noise. The lights began to flicker, plunging the house into intervals of total darkness. And then, in the midst of this chaos, the presence I had feared finally manifested. In the darkest corner of the room, a shadow began to form, a darkness denser than the night itself. At first, it was just an indistinct blur, but as the flickering light illuminated the room, the shadow took shape. A dark, tall, and distorted figure seemed to emerge from the very darkness, absorbing all the light around it. This presence, this thing, was pure evil. We could feel its energy, a piercing cold that penetrated to the bone. It had no face, but even so, I knew it was watching us, feeding on our fear. Julia and the kids were paralyzed, the terror visible in each of them. It was as if the house, the shadowy figure, and all that malevolent energy were connected, forming a single entity that now fully manifested. I tried to move, to do something, but it was as if my entire body was being drained. The figure seemed to expand, filling the space with an almost tangible darkness. I could feel my energy being sucked away, as if each second in the presence of that thing was consuming me, exhausting me. The room began to spin around me, and my vision blurred. I saw Lucas and Clara fall to their knees, their faces pale and their eyes glazed. Julia was beside me, but she seemed distant, as if she was drowning in a sea of despair. I knew we needed to react, but every attempt to resist seemed futile. Then something inside me rebelled against that feeling of helplessness. I couldn't let this destroy us. With the last bit of strength I had left, I screamed, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of my being. It wasn't a scream of fear, but of pure determination, a call for us to fight, not to be consumed. The sound echoed through the house, and for a brief moment, the shadowy figure hesitated. The windows stopped banging, and the trembling in the walls diminished. I took advantage of that fraction of a second to move, grabbing Lucas and Clara, trying to pull them away from that thing. Julia, with the strength I didn't know she still had, got up and helped us move the kids away. But the malevolent presence was still there, watching, waiting. I knew it wasn't over. We had won a small victory, but we were far from safe. The house was alive, and it wanted to devour us. And the worst part was that I had no idea how to escape. With my family gathered around me, I tried to find a way out, a solution. But deep in my heart, I knew the real battle was still to come, and that, to win it, we would need more than just physical strength. We would need courage, and perhaps even a sacrifice I wasn't yet ready to make. After that terrible manifestation of the shadowy presence, it was clear that we needed to leave the house at all costs. But the house wasn't ready to let us go. We could feel the danger in every wall, in every shadow. But what truly terrified us was the growing sense that we were not alone, that someone or something was relentlessly pursuing us. Julia and I decided it was time to act. We couldn't wait any longer. We needed to find a way out, even if it meant facing whatever was hunting us. With the kids by our side, we armed ourselves with whatever we could find in the house. A kitchen knife, a piece of wood, anything that might give us a chance. We descended to the ground floor, our hearts pounding in our chests. The house was silent now, a silence that made every step sound like thunder. The feeling of being watched was oppressive, as if invisible eyes were following us all the way. I knew the killer was there, waiting for the right moment to strike. When we reached the front door, something sent a chill down my spine. The door was ajar, a sign that someone or something had passed through there recently. Terror gripped me, but I forced myself to keep going, to protect my family at all costs. We stepped outside and ran toward the road, but the darkness seemed to engulf us, as if the very air was conspiring against us. As we advanced, I heard a noise behind us, quick, heavy footsteps, as if someone was running to catch up to us. "Run!" I shouted, forcing the children to move faster. Lucas and Clara were exhausted, but fear drove them on. Julia was right behind, holding Clara's hand, but I knew we couldn't keep up this pace for long. Then, out of nowhere, he appeared. The killer, a shadowy and distorted figure, emerged from the darkness like a predator who had finally found its prey. He had no face, just a shadow that seemed to absorb all light around it, and in his hands he held something that gleamed in the dim light, a long, cruel blade. Before I could react, he lunged at us with terrifying speed. I turned to face him, trying to protect my family, but he was relentless. In a swift movement, he struck, and Julia, who was closest, was the first to be hit. The sound of the impact was followed by a horrible scream. Julia fell to the ground, clutching her side where the blade had struck. Blood flowed between her fingers, and my heart nearly stopped in fear. I ran to her, but the killer was upon us, an unstoppable force determined to finish us all. "Julia, no, stay with me," I shouted, trying to stop the bleeding, but the wound was severe. She looked at me, her eyes wide with pain and fear, but still begging me to protect our children. "Go," she managed to whisper, with surprising strength, "save the children." But I couldn't leave her there. I couldn't abandon her. The killer was only a few steps away, advancing with terrifying calm, as if he knew the victory was already his. I stood up, desperation giving me strength I didn't know I had, and faced him. With the knife I held, I attacked, trying to drive him away from my family. But he was quick, and every move he made was calculated to leave me at a disadvantage. The fight was intense, a battle for survival that seemed to last an eternity. But no matter how much I fought, he was relentless, determined to end us all. Lucas and Clara, terrified, tried to help as best they could, but they were just children, powerless against that monster. All I could think was that I needed to keep them safe, no matter the cost. But the killer was relentless, and I knew that if we didn't escape soon, there would be no salvation for any of us. Finally, in a stroke of luck or desperation, I managed to wound the killer enough to gain a moment's advantage. I grabbed Julia, who was weak and almost unconscious, and ordered Lucas and Clara to run toward the road. I knew that moment of hesitation might be our only chance. Running with Julia in my arms, I followed the children down the dark road. The killer was still behind us, but his pursuit had slowed, as if he was wounded or allowing us to escape for his own sick game. I didn't know if we would truly escape, but at that moment, all that mattered was to keep fighting. Julia was losing blood rapidly, and I knew time was against us, but I couldn't stop. Not now, not with the killer still hunting us. I had only one thought in mind: survive. And to do that, I would have to find a way to outlast the night, no matter the cost. With every step I took, I felt the weight of Julia in my arms increase, as if despair itself was trying to drag us down. Lucas and Clara ran ahead of me, breathless, their small bodies exhausted but driven by the sheer need to survive. The killer was behind us, his presence a constant shadow, relentless and determined. I knew we couldn't keep this up much longer. The sound of his footsteps was getting closer, and the darkness around us seemed alive, conspiring against us. Fear intertwined with exhaustion, and I felt the desperation growing inside me. But I knew I couldn't give up. Not now. It was then that I noticed a small side road cutting through the forest, a detour that might give us a chance to lose our pursuer. I shouted for Lucas and Clara to follow it, and they obeyed without question. We made a sharp turn, entering the narrow, overgrown path, hoping the killer wouldn't notice our movement. We ran with every ounce of strength we had left, the branches and leaves scratching us, the uneven terrain making every step difficult. The sound of the killer's footsteps seemed to fade, and for a moment I thought we had made it. But then I saw him out of the corner of my eye, on the main trail, still looking for us. He stopped, looking around, as if he knew we were nearby, but couldn't see us. It was then that an idea occurred to me, the only chance we had. I knew we couldn't keep running for much longer, not with Julia injured and the children exhausted. We needed to outsmart him, make him believe we were somewhere else. With a quick motion, I signaled for Lucas and Clara to hide in a dense cluster of bushes. I placed Julia carefully next to them, kissing her forehead and promising I would be back soon. I picked up a stone from the ground and with all my strength threw it in the opposite direction, making it hit a tree and echo through the woods. The killer heard the sound and immediately ran in the direction it came from, following the false trail. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched his silhouette disappear into the darkness. We had bought some time, but I knew it wouldn't be much. We took advantage of the opportunity and continued down the side trail, moving as quickly as we could. The main road was in sight, and I knew that if we could reach it, we would have a chance to find help. With Julia leaning on me, her strength nearly gone, and Lucas and Clara dragging behind us, we finally emerged from the forest, our bodies and minds shattered. Lights appeared in the distance, and I realized it was a house, a small cabin at the end of the road. We ran there, pounding desperately on the door. An elderly man opened it, his face marked by surprise and concern when he saw our condition. "Please, help us," I pleaded, barely able to speak. The man let us in without hesitation, locking the door behind us. His wife quickly began tending to Julia, who was pale and weak, while I tried to explain what had happened. I managed to call the police with their phone, my hands shaking so much I could barely dial the numbers. As we waited, the silence of the cabin was broken only by our heavy breathing. We were safe, at least for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The killer was still out there, somewhere, lurking, maybe even watching us at that moment. Finally, the sound of police sirens cut through the air, and I knew our long night of terror was coming to an end. The officers found us in shock, but alive. Julia was rushed to the hospital, and the children were kept under the officers' protection while I explained what had happened.